Hi, I'm Ben. Welcome to my book corner. So, 80s nostalgia is all the rage right now, and as an 80s child personally, I have mixed thoughts about some of it. So this week we're taking a look at a book that is largely inspired by a lot of the 80s cult classics. For example, Neverending Story, Dark Crystal, and for me personally, because it terrified me as a kid, the Masters of the Universe movie, and that is The Shadow Glass, that came out in March of 2022 and is authored by Josh Winning. As always, we'll take a look at the story, the characters, the world building, and then you'll have my final thoughts at the end. So without further ado, let's just jump straight in. Winning is clearly a massive fan of 80s movie storytelling, and that shines through in the story and the plot of this book. This very much does read like a sequel to an 80s movie. You have all the standard sort of fantasy tropes from the 80s here. You have a fantasy world set far away that bleeds into ours somehow. You have a chosen protagonist. You have the difficult relationship between child and parent, which you quite often got as well. You have the loss of belief in the magic of these other realms and fictions, and that is all here, and it's tied up in such a way that this reads like a sequel to an 80s movie, and you can sort of see all the beats ahead of time, but that doesn't diminish from the book. Bob Corman in the 1980s, the father of Jack, created the world of Erie. This was the setting for The Shadow Glass. However, at the time, it was a financial flop and the movie never really took off. Over the years, there was various different spin-off medias which kind of fractured the fan base, and it looks like some of that fracturing has caused issues in the real world of Erie as it's being fueled by the belief of the fans. Bob has recently died. Jack has inherited like a load of the stuff, but because of his difficult relationship with his dad, he's just getting rid of stuff to just make a quick buck when some of the puppets start to be infused with the real life essence for the characters in the story and come to life in our world. Unfortunately, this also means some of the bad guys get brought to life in our world as well, and you get a very much the 80s plot of you have a chosen protagonist who doesn't really want any part in the story or doesn't believe in the story, who sort of at the end steps up to his role as the saviour, for want of a better term, just to prevent this sort of fictional monsters from taking over the world of Erie as well as our world as well. There's no great surprises here, but it does make a really good nostalgic framework for this story. And also, it's something that the story does allude to as well, that there is a really strong sort of nostalgic high at the moment in media. Stranger Things is the most obvious example of that. And this really does tap into that very well. It's a really well told 80s film style story. The story is told from the point of view of Jack Corman. He's the son of director Bob Corman in the story, and unfortunately, due to his father's descent into alcoholism and having an issue with his grasp on reality, or so people thought, he'd become estranged from his father and he'd lost his love for the franchise that his father sort of tried to make. He was actually in the franchise as a baby, as a trash-eating goblin sort of creature, and he sort of feels this dread whenever he meets fans, so on and so forth. And you get the sense of somebody that really has tried to leave that past behind, has never quite been able to shake it off, and deep down probably hates himself a little bit for trying to do that, and feels guilty about the relationship with his father, due to the fact that when his dad needed him, he turned his back because of all the past bad blood between them. And you do have a very typical, again, 80s style character arc of the rejection of the past and the nonsense and the fiction to fully embracing it at the end. And at the end, he is actually writing a proper sequel to the story, especially when he realizes there's some stuff with some bits that he wrote as a kid that's influencing the story as well, which is actually pretty well done. He isn't a particularly likeable character. He's a bit of an ass to a lot of people. His cousin Amelia, who ended up taking over the Bobco studio in particular, gets a great deal of ire from him. And also there's like a fan group that meet up and do screenings and discuss the lore, as you do get with a lot of this 80s stuff. And the main character for that is called Toby, who is very much a die-hard lore-keeping nerd fan of the whole Shadowglass series and all the ancillary media that was produced. You also have the person at the other end on the more toxic side of a fandom that has been talking out against the extra media for years because it dilutes the message and the original product. Very much in the 90s, led a book burning, so on and so forth. And all these characters are relatively well fleshed out. The other characters worth mentioning as well are the puppet characters from the story. And they don't really get massive amounts of character development because they are the fictional characters, but they have the very almost one-dimensional setup that you quite often get for characters like that in movies, and it actually works really well here as a contrast to the human characters, and I think overall that's pretty well done. The world building here is quite interesting. So on the one hand, this is set in modern day times, and there's the nod to the current retro rave that's going through sort of Hollywood and games and various other media at the moment, and that is acknowledged very early on in the book. There's some looks at how fandoms operate, comic cons, all that sort of stuff as well. But where the world building is quite strong here is the way it looks at the fictional world of Erie and how that is influenced by the media that's happened for the film, since the film, and also the belief of the various different fandoms and how that has influenced it and how important belief is. A lot of the world building is simple, discussed dialogue of stuff from the films where the characters sort of smack their head and go, aha, I remember this in this comic strip and stuff like that, but it is pretty well done. The other thing that I think really does add to this, however, is at the start of each chapter you have sort of a media excerpt. So it could be a interview with Bob Corman on TV, it could be a little bit of information from a comic strip, it could be a review, but it's at the start of every chapter and it forms the chapter that then follows, so it gives you a little bit of context for what's about to happen. It's not too dissimilar to something that was used in The Truth, but it's used a lot more consistently here and is varied enough that it's never too long either. It's never more than 2, maybe 3 pages max, and it really does help flesh out the sort of fictional world and how that sits in relation to the current world as well. There's some really interesting stuff around how the filming worked as well that's touched on in here, especially like the prosthetics, the props, the puppets, and how they came up with some of those ideas. And again, that really does inform a lot of what goes on here. So the world building is probably the strongest aspect of this book for me personally. Final thoughts, we'll start with content warning. There is violence depicted in this, there is some mild horror. I don't really see this as a horror title, however, any more than I would see Dark Crystal as a horror film. This is unashamedly an 80s movie book, and for that reason it is really good if you like the 80s movies. If you're not a massive fan of the 80s movies, and there was a lot of cliches and a lot of stuff in those movies that weren't great for me personally growing up, then your like of this book will actually vary a little bit, but it has clear character arcs, the world building is pretty good, the writing is very sharp, and you can tell that Winning has some experience within sort of the inner workings of the film industry due to his other jobs that he's had throughout his life, and his love really does come through in the pages of this book. So for me, this is going to sit in high B tier, and that's simply a matter of taste personally. Whilst there are some 80s movies that I do like, I am an 80s child, and some of them scared and scarred me as a child. Masters of the Universe and Skeletor, I'm looking directly at you here for that one. But on saying that, if you like the 80s, you'll love this book, and it's a really well written book as well. But overall, that's my thoughts on the Shadowglass. Have you read this title? What do you think about it? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll catch you all again next week.